Hey guys, welcome to episode 2 of the DevOps 101 series. In this episode, we're going to be discussing why DevOps engineers are needed. If you're new to this podcast series, my name's Tish and I've been a DevOps engineer since November 2021. So I'm fairly new, but I'm doing this series so that I can share my experience and so that you guys can learn with me. And also, if you're interested, you can also just get into the field and get started in DevOps engineering. So, in last week's episode, we discussed what DevOps actually is and sort of why we touched on why DevOps engineers is important, but we basically just talked about why it's important that sort of DevOps exists and how to get started. And if you haven't seen that, you can listen to my previous podcast. So essentially, why DevOps engineering is needed is because the traditional processes, and we touched on that last week, the traditional processes of how teams communicate with each other, meant that there was this silos in between, so businesses weren't communicating properly in terms of getting products out on time and all that kind of stuff. So one of the main reasons why DevOps engineers exist is to unify those two teams. So it's to unify the developers and the operations. It's to unify the communication, to break that silos and to ensure that products are, from the time it's built so that it can get to deployment and into production as quickly as possible, efficiently as possible, as cost effectively as possible, as securely as possible, without having to communicate as individual teams. So, for example, when I'm at work, sometimes we have a few developers who are on a certain operating system or certain environment. So we might have a couple of developers who are using Linux or Ubuntu based environments, and then we might have another developer who's using Windows. Now, you can imagine that if you've got developers working on different environments and they push their code, when that then reaches production, depending on what the production environment is like or how it's set up, things may not get tested in the correct way or it may not be built in the correct way. So can you imagine that if you need to, for example, install some tools such as build tools such as NPM, let's say you need to install NPM on your device in order for you to test your code locally or your product or your web app or whatever locally, you can imagine that on Windows, it's going to be a different command to install NPM than if you were on Linux or Mac or Ubuntu. So this is where DevOps comes in. So just take in mind that you have an engineer who's on Windows, they've pushed their code, but the production environment is Ubuntu based. Some things are not going to line up, and this is where DevOps engineers come in, because we're going to touch on this a little bit later, the roles and responsibilities of a DevOps engineer, but you can imagine already that's an issue. And we've not even covered the security and scalability and all that kind of stuff just yet. So when you basically have DevOps engineers to solve these issues, and working as a DevOps engineer, or if you come from software development, or if you come from, I don't know, back-end development, it might be difficult to see the place or see the fitting of why DevOps engineers are needed. But until you sort of work in an agile team that's developing a product, developing a web app, or developing an application in general, you can always see those sort of barriers that are in place, because the DevOps engineer or the DevOps engineering team does not exist to break down those barriers and make sure that everything's sort of going through this CI/CD process. So we touched on this last week as well, and CI/CD is essentially just the process and the infinite process, should I say, of continuous integration. So that's continuing the integration of code, of updates, of software updates, and all that kind of stuff. And the deployment is actually pushing out that continuous integration into the production environment. And DevOps engineers, that's what they do. They maintain that CI/CD process. They make sure that they can make sure that that process is as quick as possible. They can make sure it's as secure as possible. And, we'll talk about stuff like that in upcoming podcasts, like how do DevOps engineers implement security, and how do they maintain scalability, and how do they actually sort of implement scalability when it comes to the infrastructure of what sort of production sits on and how it's hosted, should I say. And we have all these different things. We have DevOps tools, we have DevOps processes, we have this CI/CD that needs to be maintained. And you can imagine that if you're a software developer and you're working on front end, or you may be working on back end, imagine all you having to implement all those tools on your day to day, as well as doing your coding. That's a lot. That's where you have DevOps engineers. So because they specialize in those tools, in implementing those tools, in updating those tools, and in general maintenance of these DevOps CI/CD and type of tools. And if we talk about briefly just about the roles and responsibilities of a DevOps engineer, if you imagine that the roles and responsibilities of a software developer, let's go with a front-end developer who's developing a web app. You can imagine that their primary role is to develop the web app, and their primary responsibility is to essentially implement from a UI design in code so that the web app looks like something and functions like something. So that's, if we just take that, and then if we place DevOps in there, I'd say DevOps has the role of ensuring that whatever that developer has built, they've used best coding standards, their code that they use, maybe some modules that they've used has some security bugs. We don't know that until we implement something to actually test against that code, to run against that code, such as Sneak. And then you've got all the infrastructure. You need to have the infrastructure in place, or maybe you're currently hosting all your infrastructure on virtual machines. The next step might be containerization. How do we get that infrastructure into Kubernetes? That's a whole other side of DevOps, and we'll touch on that in upcoming podcasts. But the roles and responsibilities essentially of a DevOps engineer is to design, build, test, deploy, and maintain CI/CD. So design aspect comes in how the actual process of CI/CD looks. So from, how do we design that? How are we going to actually implement this? And this is sort of overview of all the tools that you're going to need to actually implement CI/CD in an organization or in a team. And then you've got build. So how are we building this app so that it can work in production? How are we building these things locally? Because DevOps engineers we're not there just to, see how the production environment is. We're also there to ensure that the developers are working locally in the same way that production is being tested and production is live. So you want to make sure that developers are using the same tools and the same setup that is going to be implemented in a pipeline, for example, to build a deployment of an application. You want to make sure that both coexist. And then you've also got, so test it, writing tests to ensure that the code that you have built, so the code that you have built to build the deployment process, you want to ensure that things are being tested as you go along. It's kind of similar to white and black box testing in software development. So in software development, you want to be writing tests against like functions so that you know that function, if it's going to be reused, it works that one time. So you don't have any worries that function you're maybe using is going to be broken further down the line. So you want to sort of write tests, when you're building your YAML build pipelines, and we'll talk about pipelines in an upcoming video as well. But essentially, a pipeline is part of the CI/CD process. So if, for example, imagine you have a repo or a repository that has some project files in it, has the code that the developers have been writing. In order to actually get that code and deploy it, you need a pipeline. And the pipeline is where you stipulate certain stages and tasks. So, for example, a task can be to download npm and install it on that virtual machine or on that environment that's actually been run against the pipeline. So in the pipeline, you'll stipulate what host agent or what environment you actually want to carry out all of these stages and tasks. And you want to ensure that you've got these sort of, you want to ensure that you've got these things in place so that you can build the project effectively and test it effectively. And then that kind of leads into the deployment. So, you deploy the project, but what happens after that? And this is where the maintenance of CI/CD comes into. You can use tools like Jenkins. You can use tools like Azure DevOps. They have their sort of own CI/CD process in there, but I'd say tools like Jenkins, you have a lot more options, should I say, with tools like Jenkins. And I've personally not used Jenkins just yet, but we use Azure DevOps, and we use a bit of Octopus Deploy and tools like that. But I'm aware that those sort of names throwing out there are going to be tech jargon to a lot of viewers. So essentially, all I'm saying is when you deploy the code, so when you've built the pipeline, so the coder has coded, right? They've committed to the repository. The repository has a pipeline which will take that code, build it, and it will deploy it to the environment that you specify. Now, once it's deployed to that environment, you've got to maintain it. You've got to ensure that, you've got things being run against it. You've got to ensure that security is implemented and that kind of thing. So that's what I mean by maintenance of the deployment and things like that. And I wanted to sort of touch on some questions that had been asked in previous videos about why DevOps engineers are needed, and sort of people not really understanding essentially what the purpose or the role is. And, we're going to dive a little bit deeper because I've given a quick overview, and I want to make sure that you guys can walk away from this podcast understanding exactly what DevOps engineers are doing and what they need to do and why they're needed. And, so if you've never had an IT job and you've never done any coding or anything like that, then this example will probably apply to you. So imagine that you've got let's say your internet service provider. Let's say your internet's going down and you've done the usual troubleshooting steps to try and get it back up. The first thing you're going to do is contact your internet service provider. The person you're going to speak to is someone from customer service, and then they're probably going to escalate your case to technical support. And maybe it's an issue in your street, so they're going to send an engineer out, right? If you take the behind the scenes of that, I can explain it to you in a way that I've experienced. So you have customer service and sometimes even technical support. They would be classed as first or second line support analysts, right? And you've then even got third line engineers who are going to be the people that are potentially out about on the street and fixing the issue in real time. And you might even have third line engineers who don't necessarily go out to the street and are fixing the issue technically via their computer, right? So once that's the process that would be behind the scenes if someone was to call their internet service provider for an issue. Now, I'm not saying DevOps has anything to do with this example, but what I am saying is that DevOps engineer would sit alongside the team that maybe are working on the service in itself. So let's say there is an application, right, that monitors and tracks when people's internet has gone down. The DevOps team would be working with the developers and the operations guys to ensure that that app is being deployed as quickly as possible. Now, without the DevOps team, what would happen was the third line engineer maybe using this software, they would probably run into issues with, maybe the application is running slow, maybe it's hosted on really outdated infrastructure. There's lots of reasons why the DevOps engineer, so you could see DevOps engineering sits at quite a high level compared to IT support. And I'm using this comparison because a lot of my viewers and listeners are, they're either freshers or they're making the career switch into IT, or they're just wanting to get into DevOps because, I don't know, they've watched my videos and they seem interested, So that's sort of where DevOps will sit. And in my opinion, we don't really deal with customers. I don't deal with customers. My customers are actually the product team, and my customers are product team, and they are the product owner, stakeholders, my colleagues. If, for example, my colleague is building something locally on their machine and they're like, oh, Tish, this is taking way too long. I'm having to do this task over and over again. We can log a ticket on the board to investigate that. We call that spikes, where you log a ticket to research something or how it can possibly be done. And, or if we don't need a spike because we might know already how to do it, we would log a ticket. And if it's urgent, we would add it into our sprint. And if not, we would add it to our backlog. And all these again, so sprint, backlog, tickets and that kind of stuff. I will talk about that in upcoming, either it will be a video or it will be a podcast. But essentially, I wanted to talk about stuff about Agile and the methods that DevOps may use, and how do we actually function day to day? Like, what tools do we use to do our day-to-day tasks, and what methods do we follow to carry out tasks, essentially? So, that sort of rounds up why DevOps engineers are needed. And there's no complexity to it. It's as simple as we're needed to break down the silos to get products, environments, and get things out there faster for the business. And there's no point in overloading front-end developers, back-end developers with all these new tools, and all of these tools that DevOps engineers use as part of their day-to-day job role, because one, they'd be burnt out, and two, it's not their responsibility. At the end of the day, it's our responsibility to ensure that that product is running as best as it can. And that's essentially it. And that sort of leads me to the end of this podcast. If you guys would want to recommend any sort of future podcasts that I would like to touch on, I will be delivering my podcasts sort of every 5 weeks, so I'll be scheduling them 5 weeks at a time. So right now on my YouTube channel, you can see the first 5 episodes. Once those have been filmed, I will be scheduling the next 5, and so on and so on. So if you have any ideas or anything, just let me know, and I'll be willing to film them, because DevOps is really complex. It can be really complex, and there is a lot to cover. So guys, thank you for listening, and I'll